Hey there, here we are with the Gazette's Fact Checker team. We've got on our team Brian Morelli, Michaela Ramm, I'm Erin Jordan, and this is Molly Duffy. We've been working together for the last couple of years to check political statements made by candidates or people running for office. We wanted to talk a little bit today just about our checks of the presidential candidates that we've been doing since about July. So I wanted to maybe just kick it off and, I don't know if someone wants to tackle the idea of how we decide which claims we're going to check and how we as a team weigh those choices.
Well, I think our fact check group is a little bit unique in that we're very focused on Iowa. So a lot of times you hear whatever the topic of the day is, and it might just not qualify for us because we're trying to set ourselves apart and provide a local flavor to what we do. And so we focus on elected officials or candidates for an elected office, and also top office holders. So sometimes we get around a little bit around our rules in the sense that if there's an ad that's playing in Iowa markets on television or radio, sometimes that might be not just about Iowa, that we will also take a look at those.
Or alternatively, something said in Iowa may not necessarily pertain to Iowa, but since it happened here, we can check it.
Yeah, or stuff said about Iowa somewhere else would count for us.
Right. And one thing that we've talked a lot about with our team, we meet once a week, and when we sometimes get together, we try to look at all the candidates and try to get as many checks of different candidates as we can to kind of spread the love around. And it's not always easy to check every candidate equally because some candidates are very specific about their claims, or they may tailor their campaign speech to the state that they're in, so they might say some specific things about Iowa, and then it's easier for us to check them. Other candidates, like we've talked about with Elizabeth Warren, are more making claims about the future. We talk about how she has a plan for that. Well, those are all prospective things that we aren't necessarily able to check, so it's been a little bit harder. And Michaela, you were mentioning that, what we had to do to try to find a check for Joe Biden.
Yeah, no, that was really unique. I think the ads so far that Biden has been airing in Iowa have mostly been about himself as a person, as a candidate, as a prospective office holder, so not necessarily things that we can check. So what we finally had to do when we were pursuing a check of Biden ahead of the caucus was actually go to a campaign event and get audio of a campaign event to finally have a claim that was checkable. And I can talk a little bit about that claim if we want to dig into that, or...
Yeah, that one had a fair amount of debate.
Yeah, that one we talked about a lot. And I think it goes to, the amount of work that goes into each fact check we do and the conversations we have, not just in our weekly meetings, but throughout the week as one person is writing the check and working on the check.
So what was your process for that? Like, where did you start?
Yeah, so
Or tell us, I guess, what the claim is.
Yeah, so the claim, well, first I talked to a reporter to get the audio of the event, and we found a claim where he said, in your state, your governor goes ahead and privatizes Medicaid, which is why hospitals aren't getting paid on time, so they're shutting down. They're shutting down their emergency services, and they're at risk. So we have that claim, and we kind of discuss it as a group and decide, okay, we'll pursue this. So to go forward with that, then usually my first step is to reach out to the campaign themselves, see where they've gotten this information, see what kind of research they have on hand to support this particular candidate's claim, where they're getting this particular information. And in this case, the campaign came back with articles that the Gazette has written about this particular issue, which is always kind of unique stance to be in because I wrote most of those articles.
Like flattering, but also a
Right.
difficult
It's a
position.
little
Yeah. It's like, I better be right on this then.
Right.
Yeah, but that one really spurred unique conversation among the group because we really had to decide. So we found that, right off the bat, the claim is half wrong. No hospitals are shutting down in Iowa. No hospitals are shutting down their emergency services. But he is correct in that, Medicaid has been a real challenge for providers. They're dealing with a lot of late payments from Medicaid. It's putting them at risk, some research has shown. So we had a really intense debate about do we look at it, the claim as a whole, or do we look at it in pieces? And I don't know if, Erin, you want to talk about your line of thinking in that, because I know you had a thought on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I felt like when you draw a conclusion, you say because of these delayed payments, hospitals are closing. It's like a cause and effect. If the effect that's listed is not true, to me, the whole claim is suspect, But if you break it down, that one thing is true and also another thing is true, then it kind of depends how you look at it. So we went back and forth on it, and all of us weighed in. And what did we settle on?
We ultimately settled on a C. We settled on looking at the claims individually rather than looking at them as a whole. So yes, he was incorrect on the hospitals are closing, emergency services are closing, but he was correct about Medicaid.
But I thought we were considering like a higher grade, and then we went with a C because we felt like that conclusion was important. Or,
Yeah.
That was my recollection. too.
Yeah, I think the initial idea was to give him a B.
Yeah.
Because the kind of like supporting statements that he had made were all true, but his conclusion was wrong.
Right.
So then ultimately we did decide that his conclusion was so wrong that it kind of warranted a knockdown.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that was like the larger, that was the thrust of his, that was my watch. That was like the thrust of the statement was the conclusion, it's like, so even though individual parts may be checked out, the conclusion didn't.
Right.
Yeah. And that, I think, like, that's one of my favorite things about being on the fact checker team is, we'll write these checks, but then they're like really toughly scrutinized by the entire team. And, sometimes we all kind of agree, and then sometimes we have these big debates where we end up changing the grades or asking for additional evidence. It's just, I think we're like very rigorous, and I appreciate all of your guys' feedback every time.
Yeah.
One thing I thought was interesting about that one was just sort of like how you interpret what someone says and how much, I think that's a great example of how much gray area there is in a lot of political claims.
Yeah.
Like there's so many different ways of looking at it and like measuring it. And one thing in particular is they use I got in that particular claim with Joe Biden, I got hung up on the words emergency services, right? And because you could look at, so is an emergency service the same as like an emergency room, or are we talking about, 911, those types of like, immediate life-saving services. And so, that was another like, kind of example of really sort of dissecting what they said and not, you don't always agree.
And I think the team approach helps because if you start writing a check and you get immersed in it and you kind of are going down one road, you might have blinders on to some other pieces of information that are out there. And then when you put it out to the team and people give their feedback and say, we need some additional sourcing here or there, that really helps have a rounded check. And another thing that I think is helpful about it is that then when we issue the grades, we know it's been vetted with the team and that we all stand behind that grade. And it makes it easier when or if campaigns or anyone else come back and say, we disagree with your grade, you're way off base. We've already talked about those arguments, and we can defend that work in a better way.
Well, sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, and we also, especially if there's some disagreement, we try to work that into our analysis and point out, like, we've considered this and we considered this. Ultimately, like, a grade is a grade. It's not like an exact science. So,
Right.
We can defend our grade, but we provide as much information as we can so the reader can say, you know what, I think that's a D or I think that's a B, and I think that's helpful also.
And we put tons of hyperlinks in these stories, like more than I do with any other stories, so that readers can go back and actually find that Government Accountability Office report, or can find the statements and that kind of thing, so they can make their own decision. If they disagree with us, at least we've given them the sourcing that they can make their own call. I wanted to ask you, Molly, you did one of the checks that was related to a PAC in this cycle, and we don't have a ton of those. We tried to focus more on statements actually made by the candidates themselves, but you had one, I believe, was by the One Nation PAC. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, so I'm trying to pull it up on my phone here, but I checked a claim that it was basically a hit ad on Medicare for All and those plans, sort of attacking the idea that if we implemented Medicare for All, wait times for medical services would go way up. And so that paper, they sourced, it was all kind of based on this one paper. I cannot find it. But generally, it was just based on this one paper. And so I ended up digging into that report, and it was based on some surveys and digging into those surveys. So we kind of explained how the PAC got those numbers, but then I also went and looked at sort of like the federal side, like Canada's version of the CDC, and what their numbers said, and kind of found some gray area there. And I don't remember what did we land on for that one? Do you remember?
We gave them a C.
It was a C.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think, I don't know.
I think they were long. I think they were more comparable than they made them sound in the ad. Like the American wait times were in some cases closer to Canada's than they said in the ad.
Yeah, and it's just a hard comparison to make because the systems are so different.
Yeah. And I think there was also, if I remember correctly, there were problems with that study too, because I think it was like a self-reported survey, and it had a very low number of responses.
Right. Yeah, it was doctors self-reporting.
Right.
And so and I mean, I think there's well-known criticism of that report specifically because we just sort of, as survey respondents, are biased to complain about the stuff that bothers us day to day. Like if you're a doctor and your wait time is really high, you're more likely to respond to a survey about wait times than somebody who has really low wait times and isn't really like having that at top of mind.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And I found it on my phone if you want to erase it. Right. But yeah, I think that was one of the bigger, if I remember correctly, one of the bigger reasons I think we ended up docking that grade. And I think that was a pretty good group consensus. I don't think there's much disagreement on that.
Well, and with PAC ads too, Michaela, you were speaking of, you had done one that wasn't in the presidential race, but it was hard to get a hold of the PAC, right?
Yeah, so that was one. I believe that was an attack ad against Representative Abby Finkenauer. And I believe that was an RNC funded ad that was all about, this was when impeachment trial was just starting in the House, and it was sort of attacking Finkenauer for being supportive of the impeachment trial. And it's sort of, I think it tried to equate her to, a lot of progressive Democrats who were really vocal about wanting this impeachment, and I think it was trying to, put her in line with people who were pushing for that. What was troubling about that one was that it was just difficult to get information on their claims. So, when you have a PAC that's sort of a shell company of a shell company, or so I reached out to the RNC directly, and that was one where I never got a response on those information. So, and we've had to deal with this before, where it just sort of, we have to do the best research we can and try to find what information is available on these particular claims.
So in that case, it wasn't a PAC, but it was a national group that is harder to kind of get someone to listen to you. If it's like the candidate running for office in Iowa, their campaign folks are a lot of times in constant communication with media because they're trying to get coverage. So it's easier for us to reach out to them and say, what's the sourcing for your ad, versus like a national group, which we have done some of those from, either PACs or national groups or that sort of thing.
Yeah. It's also surprising, like, especially if there's a television ad or claims that a candidate's making over and over, how quickly they do have the background information. Sometimes it's just a quick email and all of a sudden they send you like 4 links to different reports, or like, here you go. But other times, like you were saying, you really have to dig in, and especially when they point you to like newspaper articles, because we look for actual official reports and government documents and data to as the foundation for, we try to go to the foundation of the where the claims come from.
It's funny to watch campaigns. Sometimes will tweak their messaging in response to a fact checker. Like, didn't you have one of those where someone was claiming to have like made the most trips to Iowa, and it was like blatantly wrong?
Yeah, that was Beto O'Rourke.
Yeah.
And he said he had been to Iowa the most he had more times than any other candidate, which was clearly wrong because at that point it was Delaney. And so by the time they responded, they were like, look, he's been to the most, since he declared, I think is what they changed it to. Like, he's been here the most time since he declared, which was like a few months. And, it's like you can't change what your statement is, like, after you've made it.
Yeah.
Well, you can change it in the future.
You can
stop saying it.
And we see that sometimes too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and just for the record, that Beto check was on July 11th. It's our only F of the whole cycle. So,
Good job, Beto.
yeah.
And just so no one thinks that we drove him out of the race, he lasted several more months before he decided to drop out of his own.
Yeah.
Send your hate mail to Brian.
Right, can't trace it to you only.
Well, and Brian, you had a check like a few weeks ago that was really involved. I remember maybe more complicated than even some of our others that have been complicated.
Well, are you talking about the Andrew Yang?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So one nice thing about Andrew Yang is he, from a fact-checking perspective, he is, he's the math guy, right? That's one of his like sort of slogans. But he makes a lot of claims and uses a lot of numbers. So he had this claim about Amazon. Basically how much business it was taking from the local economy and like how many jobs and malls that were closing down. And, we really had to break it up. Like, so the claim was Amazon soaking up $20 billion in business each year. So that's one thing to look up. Causing 30% of your stores and malls to close. So that's another. It also talked about how much Amazon is paying in federal taxes each year, which was 0. And then he kind of goes on to talk about how, the effect on local retail workers, which he said in Iowa is $9 to $10 per hour. So there was a ton to check in there. And one of the tricky things about that claim was there was a certain... there was a kind of a sequence. He had, it was like he had built up to make points. So it's like, if this is true and this is true, this must be true. And so, you kind of try to follow their thinking. One thing for this claim, I actually reached out to a professor, an economics professor, to help me understand the math because, we're not experts. We're in a lot of this stuff, but I was able to kind of talk through and like, okay, how do you understand what a company like Amazon is paying for their federal income tax? And that was pretty helpful. We ended up on a C for that one, by the way, which Yang's folks are very active, so we got a lot of feedback as well.
Feedback.
Yeah.
Feedback.
No, but I think one of the others, so of our checks, we checked Andrew Yang the most. And I think that is because of the reason that Brian mentioned, that he's been very specific. And when he comes to Iowa, he makes statements about Iowa, and that fits into our criteria of things we check. So it isn't that we favor him or disfavor him. It's just because of the way that he campaigns and the way he speaks.
One thing on that one that I think that we spent some time with was looking at like how much malls were closing. And so a lot of his information was based on a report. So he said 30% of your malls and stores are closing. And he was basing it on something that hadn't yet happened. There were some forecasts that, in the future, we're going to lose 30% of malls and stores. And so that was one reason we downgraded him.
Yeah. We've had a couple of checks, haven't we, just based on projections or things that might happen. I remember I checked one for Delaney where he said if we were a part, I don't remember the claim specifically, but if we were a part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, land value would be higher for farmers. And so we sort of had to go through that, if your crop prices are higher, does that mean your land value goes up? And so that was kind of tricky, finding studies that were based on things that may or may not happen.
Mm-hmm. Right, and I think what helped us do that one is when it was about farm value, so very relevant to Iowa, and there's a lot of research about farm value and what influences it. So we had some more details that we could use to show whether these projections were likely to be accurate. Or that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that was one I relied on an economist too to sort of help draw that connection and draw that conclusion too.
I feel like we try also to, as much as we try to both, see what maybe doesn't add up, but we also try to prove it true as well. So, like in the Yang one, I tried to look at, the store closure piece from a bunch of different perspectives. So not only like, okay, well, how many stores have closed and how many malls have closed, like how many square footage has closed, how have we lost, So I feel like we do try to give people the benefit of the doubt in what they're saying. But if the facts don't support it, then they don't support it.
Right.
So.
Molly, what would you say do you think is one of the more interesting checks you've had this cycle? Put you on the spot
I did
here.
a check of Yang a couple weeks ago.
What about your Klobuchar one you have coming up this week?
Yeah, we'll have a check of Klobuchar in a couple days. She is claiming to have the most endorsements of current and former Iowa legislators, which is very specific.
And perfect for fact checker.
So it is true. Her campaign is citing Iowa Starting Line, which is a left-leaning political site that covers Iowa politics. And they have a pretty thorough endorsement checker for all of the candidates, and she does have a pretty hefty lineup of Iowa state lawmakers on there. That said, she comes nowhere close to having the most endorsements overall from prominent Iowans. So it's narrow for a reason, which I think is pretty common. They pick their words carefully for a reason.
And I think that's one thing that we kind of can bring to the table. Like, okay, yeah, that's true, but maybe here's some other information too. Like, we're not saying she's wrong, but also know this,
Yeah. I think even checks that we do where we give folks an A, I think if you read the whole check, you understand the broader context. It's not like a pat on the head and you got an A. It's pretty thorough no matter what.
And I like that. I feel like we're bringing more education to the issue. And we've chosen some checks in the past that just because we thought it was a super interesting topic that hadn't been explored very much.
I was thinking of the check that you did on Kamala Harris.
Yeah.
That was
my favorite.
checks.
So that was one that was in October that she had made. She said that soybeans were rotting in bins.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and because of I think because of the flooding and that kind of thing. Or no, it was because of the trade deals. It was because the farmers were limited in trading to China. So it was kind of one thing I thought that I liked about it is I got to talk to this Iowa State professor whose specialty is in grain drying and storage. So I think we've all talked to a lot of economists, but this was a very unique specialty. So he was able to confirm that modern grain storage with like fans and aeration and things like that, you can keep beans for up to 2 years without significant loss of quality. So, I think what happened in that case, she was kind of conflating a couple of different stories. One that a story about some farmer who had decided to kind of plow under his beans because he wasn't going to get anything from them. And then the idea that also farmers were having to store a lot of beans, but it doesn't mean that the beans that are in the bins are rotting. So that was interesting.
I really love that one because I think it's like that really wasn't her point, right? Her point, was about the trade deals. But
right, to criticize Trump.
Right, but it's like, well, you still need to have your facts in order, because like I can't remember. I don't think we ultimately weighed in on what her bigger point was. It was just like, okay, is this detail correct?
And I think we did provide the context just about
okay.
the trade deals, so that way we could understand, like you said, the whole universe of the topic. But we gave her a D. So
that's almost like the Biden check, where his broader point is that Medicaid in Iowa is a mess, in his opinion.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that hospitals everywhere are closing.
Right. It's the exaggeration that really docked them for us. And I do like that about this team. That is, we really don't have any mercy on those exaggerations.
Right.
And we find some fun topics.
Yeah.
This isn't in this cycle, but I remember doing one once that someone had talked about how some dollar amount could buy like X number of Casey's taco pizzas. And I mean, this was fun, calling Casey's and like figuring out how much it costs to buy a taco pizza.
Was there an economist who could weigh in on that one?
No, I think I just had to like call a number of places.
Do
That
math.
that was kind of fun. Yeah, we had to do some math. But so just I think one thing we've got coming up this weekend is with it being the last weekend before the Iowa caucuses. We have kind of a roundup about the 12 checks we've done of Democratic presidential candidates that are still in the race, and we'll provide some brief summaries of those in case people want to use that in their decision making for the caucuses. But just because the caucuses are going to be over in a week doesn't mean our team dissolves. So if you were thinking that, too bad. But we're gonna keep
Not going away.
Right.
Erin will continue to be guys.
Right, exactly. But we want to hear from readers if there's things that you guys are out and about and hear from your elected officials, or you read something or you see an ad. You can email us at factchecker@thegazette.com, and we will then consider those claims as part of our weekly meetings. So
Maybe we could talk for a second about where some of our fact check. I mean, we kind of talked about some are coming from advertisements. I know I found a fact check one time from a newsletter like that. Remember
Right.
the Rod Sullivan one came from a newsletter.
well, and so did the Ashley Hinson one.
The Ashley Hinson one came from a
Email?
someone had this was like, so we totally encourage people to send us things to check. So this was one, someone had received a mailing, like for a fundraising mailing that was asking for money, and they what do you call it, screenshot it, Xerox copied it and send it to us. That had some things to check in there. So it was a letter, basically. She had sent
We
there.
found a lot this cycle from mailers that have come to our houses and other folks' houses.
Yeah.
Also from campaign ads as they've appeared on YouTube and TV. Lots of times the campaigns will, when they are putting an ad on TV, they're also dropping it on YouTube on the same day. So we can do that. Like Michaela said, we've found some actually from town halls or other events here in Iowa. We did a lot of reviewing of like the soapbox speeches from the Iowa State Fair.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Those
you
were,
know.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
And then what was that one that we got fairly recently that was someone had asked us to look into?
That was a was it
Was
a
that the
Yang
Yang
one?
one?
I think that's the one that I did on Yang. It was
Okay.
about he had said that most of the research that the FDA relies on to approve new drugs is federally funded.
Oh yeah.
I think we give him a B on that because
Yeah.
it's partially federally funded.
yep, I have B.
Yeah.
I love.
Yeah.
I think we got some interesting ones from
But that
the
was
readers.
great, and I mean, we had done so many checks of Yang for like the reasons you said, but I think having a reader reach out and say, "Hey, I'm curious about this," that was a real driver, I think, for us to do that one, in spite of all the ones we had already done.
Yeah, it kind of puts it to the top of the list.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that the fact checker has been, there's a lot of interest in the community. I know I've spoken at a couple different groups, like League of Women Voters and others, just about the process and about that we have this this team going here at the Gazette. So it really is helpful if the community contributes, and like we kicked that one to the top of the list.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with others that readers might find of interest.
So for people who might send claims in, what's our criteria again?
Yeah, our criteria is that it must be a statement made by an Iowa political candidate or office holder, or a national candidate / office holder about Iowa, or in ads that appear in our market. And claims have to be independently verifiable. And just for people who aren't familiar, we give ads grades from A to F based on accuracy and context. So we have some of our kind of methodology for it online, but we try to be consistent across the board so we can hold candidates to the same standard.
Mm-hmm.
So pretty much anything said by like an Iowa official is fair game, right?
Yeah.
Local or statewide
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
federal.
Yeah, it could be state legislator or county supervisor or
School board member.
school board members.
Mhm.
Yes.
So we'll wrap up here, but we just appreciate the connection with the community for the fact checker, and we appreciate the opportunity to weigh in on how the candidates are doing with their accuracy. So thanks a lot, guys.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.